After some massive injuries at the wide receiver position in week 4, plus 4 teams on a bye heading into week 5, we've got a ton that we need to talk about, and we got to try and find some players that are going to help us through the next couple of weeks. If you went wide receiver early in this year's draft, things are not looking great unless you picked Amon-Ra St. Brown or Puka Nacua. So how do we get your lineup set so you can start taking advantage of some of the under the radar guys that are putting up solid fantasy points? Starting off on Thursday Night Football, the 49ers, the LA Rams, and we're already going to have a couple of question marks at the wide receiver position for San Francisco, because as of Wednesday, Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings were not practicing. Now maybe Wednesday afternoon they get out there and practice, but as of this recording, they have not been out there, and they play Thursday night. So both of them are probably going to be questionable at this point in time. And it's a solid matchup. The Rams are currently allowing the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But there's something that we need to keep in mind when Brock Purdy's the quarterback, and that he's going to spread the ball around. Last week, 37 targets went to 9 different players for the 49ers. And then on top of that, CMC is their number 1 receiver right now, even though he's a running back. Ricky Pearsall, he hasn't been that good this season. He's had some decent games, and we still continue to run him out there because he's got potential given what weapons are around him right now. But so far this season, he does have a couple of wide receiver 2 finishes. But outside of that, he's been the wide receiver 39 and the wide receiver 50. I'd like to pick one of these guys at least against the LA Rams, but as of this recording, I don't even know who may end up playing this week. Juwan Jennings is still banged up. Ricky Pearsall left the game last week, ended up coming back, but he's still not practicing. Keep an eye on this, especially in the rankings videos. The 49ers are currently allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but honestly, that's definitely not stopping us from starting Puka Nacua, and Davante Adams' touchdown upside is way too much to pass on right now. Even on Thursday Night Football, even against a tough defense. And before you ask, no, we're not going to name Tutu Atwell. He had one 88-yard touchdown reception. That's more receiving yards than he had in every game combined coming into week 4. Puka Nacua might be the safest wide receiver in all of football right now. Him and Amon-Ra St. Brown are at the very top. And Davante Adams, tons of touchdown potential every single week, and the LA Rams are doing a solid job of moving the football. I know Thursday Night Football, it can be weird at times, and this is a tough matchup, but realistically, you're playing both of these guys, especially Puka. Minnesota has an international game for the 2nd week in a row, but since they've been over there, maybe they'll already be acclimated and they'll come out firing on all cylinders going up against Cleveland. And Justin Jefferson, obviously we're going to start Justin Jefferson. Last week, even though Carson Wentz wasn't all that great, 11 targets, 10 receptions, 126 receiving yards. That's what we want to see out of Justin Jefferson as many times as we can. For Jordan Addison, he had 8 targets. He caught 4 of them for 114 yards. Now, 81 were just on one play, but if they keep throwing the ball 35 times a game, Jordan Addison with 8 targets is definitely a flex option still at this point. Minnesota gave up a couple of big plays to DK Metcalf last week, which is not something that I expected them to do. I highly doubt that they're going to do that this week, though, to the Cleveland wide receivers. A couple of different reasons why. Number one, Dylan Gabriel at this point is expected to make his first career start. Not just on the road, but in a completely different country. So we're going to go ahead and skip on the wide receiver. Cedric Tillman just went on the IR with a hamstring issue. He doesn't plan on being back for the next 4 weeks, at least now, so it's going to be Jerry Jeudy. And then Isaiah Bond did see a little bit of a tick up last week with Cedric Tillman being hurt. But Minnesota currently is allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, even with the way DK Metcalf played last week. And Jerry Jeudy has been nothing spectacular. Wide receiver 31, 60, 90, and 41. Isaiah Bond will be an interesting player over the next couple of weeks in better matchups, but this week we're going to stay away from him as well. Las Vegas and Indianapolis, and a lot of people bought into Trey Tucker last week, and he was disappointing. For Jacoby Myers, he's still seeing a decent amount of targets, but if Geno Smith is going to keep turning the ball over so often, it's going to limit the upside of everybody for the Las Vegas Raiders. The Indianapolis Colts currently allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So we're going to fringe start Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker. Trey Tucker could get get back on track this week. Am I expecting big numbers? Absolutely not. But I'm expecting a competitive game where Las Vegas is going to have to continue to throw the football. For Jakobi Meyers, right now, he's 14th in targets in the league. So he is a really solid half PPR and a full PPR option. Both of these guys are definitely going to be right around that wide receiver 3 area. Jakobi Meyers, to me, in half PPR and full PPR, has the best opportunity to go up into the wide receiver 2 range. Headliner Nation, I will never understand, for the life of me, with how relaxed the NFL has become on touchdown celebrations, which they didn't used to be. They used to get on you for everything, and they have really laxed over the last several years when it comes to what type of touchdown celebrations you can do and for how long. And you know what? Adonai Mitchell, can you hold on to the football until you get into the end zone? Seriously? Like, you're a professional NFL player. You can't hold on to the football long enough. You'll get all this time to celebrate. Why are we dropping the football before we get into the end zone? There's no reason to celebrate before you cross the goal line anymore. If you're an NFL player and doing that, you're a clown. And Indianapolis has a solid matchup this week. Las Vegas is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So we're definitely going to go in on Michael Pittman being a start this week. He's now the wide receiver 12 on the season, 3 touchdowns in 4 games, and he's got a solid floor. For the wide receiver 2 position in Indianapolis this week, I'm going to lean towards Josh Downs. Alec Pierce missed last week while on the concussion protocol. Still really no update as of this recording as to whether or not he'll be able to remove himself and play this week. And Adonai Mitchell, after everything that went wrong last week, I got to assume that that dude is in the doghouse. And not only that, but all of those receiving yards he had on that one play was more than the receiving yards combined for the entire season up until that point. So Josh Downs, to me, is a solid flex option this week. It is a really good matchup. I expect we're going to run the football, obviously, with Jonathan Taylor, but I expect them to throw the ball as well. Let's lock in Josh Downs, possible flex option. Michael Pittman, though, is definitely a start. The New York Giants are going to need somebody to step up. Malik Neighbors done for the season after tearing his ACL. Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton. These guys are going to need to step up for their rookie Jackson Dart. Both of these guys are going to be my Brunt wide receivers to watch this week. Brunt has high performance workwear for any job, and these guys are going to have to be tough on the job this week because the New York Giants and Jackson Dart need them to step up. And if you're looking for some workwear that gives you all-day comfort, heavy-duty reliability, and is overall just an amazing product, then you got to check out our friends over at Brunt. And right now, you can get $10 off of your order by using code HEADLINERS when you check out. You can head on over to bruntworkwear.com or use the link in the description down below. Check out their boots, their pants, anything that you may need to be reliable on the job and feel comfortable at the same time. Darius Slayton, definitely one of my favorite waiver wire ads of the week. He's got big playability, and he hasn't had an opportunity to showcase it in a while. And now, for the rest of the season, he's going to have that opportunity. And I think Jackson Dart is going to look his way quite often. Wan'Dale Robinson, he should have a solid floor. A lot of the targets that we were seeing going to Malik Neighbors are probably going to go to Wan'Dale Robinson instead now. He's going to have a much safer floor, while Darius Slayton could have a way better ceiling. For this week, they're both fringe starts. They only attempted 20 passes last week with Jackson Dart. Now, New Orleans obviously is not a defense that is setting the world on fire right now. So there's going to be an opportunity here for them. It just depends on what the game plan is with Dart this week. The New York Giants are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. There's definitely some big play upside potential with Rashid Shaheed, and he could find himself in the end zone or at least a couple of big catches. Chris Olave, we saw his targets drop dramatically last week, first game this season with less than 10 targets, but I do anticipate him getting back on track this week with those targets. If you're looking for a fill-in because you've got a player on a bye, because you're dealing with an injury, whatever it may be, and you need some upside, Rashid Shaheed could definitely offer that to you. For Dallas and the New York Jets, we're going to continue to keep an eye on CeeDee Lamb. No word yet on when he will be able to return. The original timetable was basically 2 to 4 weeks. So I would not be shocked if we don't see him yet again in week 5, and then he comes back after this. George Pickens was fantastic last week though. 11 targets, 8 receptions, 134 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. We knew that George Pickens had that ability. It wasn't being utilized in Pittsburgh. Now it is in Dallas. And the best part about this breakout for him right now is while he does this with no CD Lamb, yeah, when Lamb comes back, he might lose out on some targets, but he's establishing that rapport with Dak Prescott that he's going to need to be a big-time player the rest of the season and continue to still see a good amount of work after he returns. Behind George Pickens and behind Jake Ferguson right now, though, realistically, it's a crapshoot. Kevontae Turpin was really the guy that everybody was talking about, but he only saw 4 targets last week. That's not nearly enough. Jalen Tolbert saw 6 targets. Somebody's going to be the wide receiver too, but as far as the third target goes on this team, I really don't have a whole lot of interest, and I don't think the Jets are the matchup to try and exploit it. Dallas continues to have just a terrible defense when it comes to allowing fantasy points. We'll take advantage of that this week with Garrett Wilson. He is lighting it up right now. He's up to wide receiver 6 on the season, seeing plenty of targets, touchdown potential. We'll roll with Garrett Wilson. He's going to be a top option this week. Denver at Philadelphia, and there's probably going to be a lot more question marks at the wide receiver position in this game than what realistically you would like. Courtland Sutton, great game last week against Cincinnati, but that defense is completely different than Philadelphia's defense. And if Bo Nix throws the ball 30 plus times in this game, then Courtland Sutton's got a great opportunity for 7 or 8 more targets. And if he can get that many, then he can probably have a solid floor this week. But the touchdown upside is really where things would start to get a little bit murky. So to me, he's more of like a low-end wide receiver 2, flex option, a wide receiver 3 this week, than the type of upside you would like to see. Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, staying away from both of those guys this week. They're kind of going back and forth. Marvin Mims did have a touchdown this past week, but it was a rushing touchdown. So realistically, do they have some big play potential? Yes, but the matchup's not one that I want to try and track down for these guys. Can you sit A.J. Brown? Can you sit Devontae Smith? Of course you could, but if you drafted either of these guys, you might not have a team where you realistically look at it and say to yourself, oh yeah, I can set these guys on a weekly basis and maybe just wait for them to get hot. The good news for A.J. Brown is he still saw 9 targets last week. Now, he only turned those 9 targets into 2 receptions for 7 yards, and Devontae Smith only had 2 targets, but right now the passing game, it's almost non-existent, it feels like, in Philadelphia. They're playing good defense. They're running the football with Saquon Barkley, but even at that point, Barkley hasn't been all that good this season. Hurts has been running the football. Dallas Goedert doesn't have gaudy numbers to look at. It's actually kind of crazy when you look at the numbers for Philadelphia and what they're doing right now, because Jalen Hurts, Spencer Rattler has more passing yards than what Jalen Hurts does. I know a lot of people are trying to jump on board with Malik Washington now that Tyreek Hill is done for the season. And when Malik Washington was drafted, I was a big fan. And he was a guy that I looked at as a deep sleeper option if Hill were to get traded or if for some reason somebody gets hurt. And that really hasn't materialized as of yet. And could it happen? Absolutely, it could. But I'm not rushing out there to spend a bunch of fab or a top waiver wire priority on Malik Washington. It's something that we are going to have to see first. And in this week's matchup, going up against Carolina, currently allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, this might not be the matchup that you want to try and test it right away. Now, so far this season, you could say Carolina has held some decent wide receivers in check. Week 1, they had Brian Thomas Jr. Week 2, Marvin Harrison Jr. And Week 3, Drake London. So they've kept some pretty good wide receivers in check so far. And that could happen this week with Jalen Waddle and Malik Washington. One of the reasons why Malik Washington is a sit and Jalen Waddle is only a fringe start for me. And honestly, this could be the all ugly game at wide receiver this week, because for as poor of a matchup as it potentially is for the wide receivers for Miami, Carolina isn't that much better. And that's crazy considering the fact that the Miami Dolphins are giving up the second most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but they're giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. One of the reasons why, they're giving up the third most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, while when you take a look at the running backs, they're giving up the 7th most fantasy points. So teams are running the football a lot against them. Tech McMillan is seeing a decent amount of targets. And outside of him, there's not really anyone else to talk about. Tech McMillan is a flex option only right now. And I did go ahead and add Bryson Tremaine to the slides this week because he jumped all the way from 28% snaps 2 weeks ago to 81% of the snaps last week with Xavier Legette missing again. And before anybody comments, I used to say Xavier Legette, and then I got a ton of comments about Kyle, it's not Legette, it's Legette, like L-E-E. And then people were like, Kyle, it's not Legette, it's Legette. So once again, I don't know what y'all want me to do because people are telling me two different things when it comes to how pronouncing his name is. For Houston this week, would love to see Nico Collins with a huge fantasy week. Baltimore allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game, and they're going to be missing some key defensive players this week. Nico is at 86% of the snaps. Hutchinson is at 68%. Kirk is closing in on Hutchinson at 61%. Now, Christian Kirk's targets, they dropped last week, but it could have been more of a result of the score of the game than anything. And this week, going up against Baltimore, I could easily see Christian Kirk being a pretty solid flex option while Nico Collins hopefully goes off. Houston is allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game. And maybe if Lamar Jackson doesn't play, Zay Flowers should be more of a fringe start, but we really don't know that as of yet still, and something that we'll need to keep an eye on with Lamar Jackson over the next couple of days. It's possible that he does end up missing this week, they go ahead and sit him for the bye, and then he comes after that. We'll have to keep an eye on all of that. So for Zay Flowers, we're still going to consider him a start for right now, but if Lamar Jackson doesn't play, he'll drop down to a fringe start instead. I think it's pretty clear at this point for the Tennessee Titans that Alec Eomanor has separated himself as the wide receiver 1 away from Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley last week, he only saw 3 targets. My boy Ao, his nickname that I've given him at this point, is at 7 targets, and he's produced the most so far this season. Now, the biggest problem is that's great. However, the offense as a whole just isn't that good right now, and it's going to take some time. Cam Ward, I mean, he's going to work through some of those rookie struggles. We've seen some good things and some bad things from him this year. Ao, to me, is just a guy that we'll consider as a fringe flex option if you're dealing with injuries or bye weeks, but I wouldn't expect a lot more than that. Marvin Harrison Jr. has a solid matchup this week to stay on track with what we saw last week, and for those of you that have him in fantasy, you would welcome another week like that. I know that for sure. Right now, Tennessee is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And I gotta give credit to Marvin Harrison Jr. and Kyler Murray for last week because there were some massive mistakes by Marvin Harrison Jr. at the beginning of the game. It caused a turnover, and he just looked like mentally he was not in the game. But him and Kyler Murray tried to stay connected, and by the end of the game, Marvin Harrison Jr. had put up some really solid numbers. Hopefully, that is a sign of things to come, though, for this duo, because we really need to see it more often with both of them. I think it's safe to say that we're going to be missing Mike Evans for at least a couple of more weeks. Now, at least he hasn't gone on the IR, so it's going to be up in the air exactly when he can return, but hamstring injuries for 30-plus-year-old wide receivers is not the best injury to try and work your way back from. So he's going to be a guy that's probably going to miss some time. This is not an easy matchup against Seattle's defense, which I really don't think gets more than enough credit. They are very, very good, allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers right now. The numbers last week for Chris Godwin, they weren't great. We know that. There was a decent amount of targets, though, and maybe those targets continue to keep up. Emeka Egbuka continues to produce, but in this matchup, for Chris Godwin being his 2nd week back from injury, even though he saw a ton of targets last week, he's still a sit option for me. For Emeka Egbuka, he's going to be a fringe start, but for a majority of teams, you're probably going to be playing him regardless. You just need to expect a lower ceiling. I know a lot of people are going to want to start Chris Godwin based on the targets alone last week, and I get that. I really do. And if Bucky Irving were to miss this week, then maybe it changes things a little bit for Chris Godwin. I don't really think it's a ton though, and personally, I would rather just wait another week until they get some better matchups than try to run him back out there in this matchup. But if you're dealing with injuries and buys, I get why you would need to start him. Tampa Bay's defense, they've been solid against the pass as well, currently allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So the ceiling for all three of these guys, not nearly as high as you would like. JSN is another safe start based alone on the volume that he's getting. He did his best to scare owners last week, though, in the first half of that game. Luckily, a couple of big plays towards the end made for a solid fantasy day. Cooper Kupp isn't really showing us anything except for the fact that LA was right. He's probably at the end of his career at this point. And for Torrey Horton, he's got some big playability, but you might not see that showcased in this game. I know I'm a Lions fan, so I'm trying not to be overly optimistic about this game in Cincinnati. But with how bad the defense has been and how bad Jake Browning has been, I don't see any type of scenario where Detroit even lets this game be close, except for the beginning of it. Right now, Cincinnati is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the 5th most to tight ends, the 2nd most to running backs, the 9th most to quarterbacks. It could end up being an absolute blowout at this point. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's the wide receiver 2 on the season. He's got 6 touchdowns in 3 games. And outside of Puka, he might be the safest wide receiver in football right now. So of course you're going to be starting him. Jameson Williams, would love to see a couple of big plays out of him. Not something that we've really seen as of yet this season. So right now his numbers do not look that good, but I would expect him to start seeing some big plays sooner rather than later, and wouldn't be shocked if it happens this week. The biggest issue is just going to be overall volume, because I think Detroit's going to run the football a lot, and I think they're going to be very successful. Detroit's defense gives up a big play or two. Absolutely they do. Jamar Chase or T. Higgins could burn Terrion Arnold for maybe a big touchdown, a couple of big plays here or there, especially with how much they might have to throw the ball in this game, depending on when exactly Detroit goes up, how much is it by, and does the offense click a little bit at the beginning to at least keep it close. For that reason, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins still need to be considered this week. If you want to bench either of them, I absolutely get it. And that's going to be a preferential thing, because if you're benching Jamar Chase, you're benching probably your number 1 overall pick. And that is really hard to do, even in a game that's not the best matchup in the world overall, but a defense that has been prone to big plays this season. Washington wide receivers, they've got a tough matchup going up against the Chargers this week, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game. Deebo Samuel started off slow last week, ended up being just fine. I would say that he's probably just fine as a start again this week. Solid wide receiver 2, a little bit of low wide receiver 1 upside as long as Terry McLaurin doesn't play. Now, if Terry McLaurin, depending on when he's going to be back, and we'll continue to monitor it, that could change things for Deebo Samuel. But even in this matchup back this week, with as banged up as Terry McLaurin is, I don't know if I would want to risk it, even if he did say he could go. However, great matchup for the Chargers. Washington's defense is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Ladd McConkey has found himself in that group of wide receivers that fantasy owners are slamming their heads on tables for drafting him where they did. And unfortunately, that's just where we live right now with Ladd McConkey. Can you drop him? No. Keenan Allen's on the wrong side of 30. Quentin Johnston hasn't been a poster boy of health since entering the league. An injury could happen at any time, and Ladd McConkey could go right back to what we saw at the end of last season. But for those of you asking if we should still start Quentin Johnston, stop. If you have Quentin Johnston, he's in your lineup. The only reason you should be asking me if you should be starting Quentin Johnston, let's say, is if you have Puka Nacua, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Romo Dunze, Garrett Wilson, JSN, Emeka Ibuka, guys like that. If you're just loaded at wide receiver, then maybe Quentin Johnston isn't an automatic start for you. He's the wide receiver 4 on the season. And you know what? If he has a bad week, he has a bad week. Some wide receivers do that. And well, actually, all wide receivers do that. For as good as Amon-Ra St. Brown has been, he was only in the wide receiver 30s week 1 of the season. Quentin Johnston absolutely could have a tough week. And you know what? We're going to go right back to him the week after, because he deserves it. He has shown us through the first 4 weeks of the season that him and Justin Herbert have a really good connection right now, and that he needs to be in our lineups. Sunday Night Football, we're going to see Stephon Diggs and the New England Patriots take on his former team and the Buffalo Bills. Now, the last time that Stefon Diggs faced the Bills, he had 8 targets, 6 receptions for 82 yards. And the good thing that we've seen with Stefon Diggs is his snap count continues to go up every single week. He was up to 63% this past week after starting the season in the 40s. And that's one thing that I mentioned is Stefon Diggs gets back on the field, showcases that he's healthy, and this team works him back in. You're going to see him on the field a little bit more, and those fantasy numbers are going to get better. And that's what happened this past week. Up to 63%. The production, fabulous. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 101 receiving yards. This is a tough matchup. 7th fewest fantasy points per game allowed by Buffalo to opposing wide receivers. But I think Stefon Diggs is a guy that we can play as a flex option, and he's going to give us some wide receiver 2 potential. Kayshon Boutte at this point, we're going to move away from him. I don't necessarily think you have to drop him right now, but after a solid start to the season, it's pretty apparent that he's not being looked at nearly enough. Demario Douglas is still getting run. Matt Collins scored last week on 1 target. And then, of course, Hunter Henry's been getting a ton of targets as well. I think it's still going to be really tough to make a call on a weekly basis whether or not you want to go with Keon Coleman or Khalil Shakir. And Khalil Shakir had a touchdown last week, and normally I would say Shakir is the safer option. Coleman a little bit more risky with more upside, but maybe Shakir just has a better floor than Coleman and a better ceiling than Coleman as well after his touchdown this past week. And Keon Coleman has been a downward trend. Started the season as the wide receiver 4. Wide receiver 79, wide receiver 74, wide receiver 49. Khalil Shakir has been a little bit better than him so far and a little bit more consistent. Started as the wide receiver 29, a bad week, dropping him all the way down to wide receiver 104, but then he was the wide receiver 22 and the wide receiver 15. So realistically, if you're looking at an option here, it's Khalil Shakir and his wide receiver 2 floor. Is there going to be a bigger mess than the Kansas City wide receivers over the next few weeks? Because you have Hollywood Brown still. You have Juju Smith-Schuster. You have Tyquan Thornton that somehow continues to find the end zone. Xavier Worthy's back from injury. You're going to get Rashee Rice back very soon. Who's going to get the ball on this team? Who's going to get the ball? And then you got to throw in, obviously, Travis Kelce as well. That's going to be 5 wide receivers and then a 6 pass catcher and Travis Kelce that Patrick Mahomes has to spread the ball around to. In this matchup this week, Hollywood Brown's going to be a fringe start. Xavier Worthy will end up being a start now that we saw that he's healthy and he can produce while he wears that sling on his arm. Not really sling, but you know what I'm talking about. He's got that on his arm to try and help. Brace is the word I'm looking for. I would redo this section, but you know what, at this point, let's just roll with it. It's a brace. We'll keep this in for people to laugh at a little bit. The brace that he's wearing, he seems fine with. After last week, he showcased that he can put up numbers with it, so we'll go ahead and list him as a start, but moving forward, good luck with these guys. Kansas City is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Not the matchup that you want if you're hoping to get Brian Thomas Jr. going. The good thing you can say about Brian Thomas Jr. is he had another 7 targets last week, and at least Parker Washington only got 2 targets. They must have heard my rant about him last week. There's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel for Brian Thomas Jr. When you take a look at his targets, he's had 7, 12, 6, and 7. Those are solid wide receiver 2 targets, especially with his big playability. They're just not turning those targets into anything as of right now. So do you want to sit him? Absolutely, go ahead. But at some point in time, you have to think that Brian Thomas Jr. is going to have a big game. And when he does, maybe it gets him back on track, but he could end up being super risky all year long. Headliner Nation, hopefully you appreciated all of the information that we had in today's start and sit wide receiver video. Make sure you leave a comment down below if you've got any pressing questions that you need help with. Also, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, turn on the bell notification so anytime we go live or we drop new content, you'll know about it right away. And just let us know how we're doing with the in-season content so far. Appreciate y'all. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching the video. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.